Hello and welcome to another video. Now in today's episode we're going to be diving into what is one of the most fascinating and iconic waves on Earth. A South Pacific reef pass in the middle of tropical Fijian paradise. It's a wave that breaks from 2 foot to 20 foot and can throw up anything from fun left-hand walls for turns to 20-30 foot barrels. Now while today Cloudbreak is super famous and was recently chosen as the new venue for the WSL finals, it hasn't always been this way. In fact, Cloudbreak has a very interesting history, and in today's episode we're going to dive into that history. So without further ado, let's get down to it. Now in terms of Cloudbreak's discovery, there are a few conflicting stories as to who was the first to surf Cloudbreak. Now from all the research that I've done, Cloudbreak was first surfed around 1978 by a bloke called John Ritter. Now John Ritter was a surf explorer who spent much time sailing and surfing around the South Pacific. He found and surfed many different waves in the South Pacific region, but by far the most special discovery was Cloudbreak. Around the same time, so in 1978 again, Will Finnegan, the author of Barbarian Days, details them camping on Tavarua, dodging snakes, fishing, eating coconuts, surfing this ridiculously shallow left reef, which is now known as restaurants. If you haven't read that book, I'd highly recommend it. I mean, it's the best surf book ever. But I think he was mostly surfing restaurants that breaks directly off Tavarua, whereas Cloudbreak breaks way further out on a different reef pass. So I don't officially have a sponsor for today's episode, but if you guys would like to support my channel more than you already do, I've just released my Patreon, and on it I'll be sharing sort of weekly surf travel articles. I'll also be doing a few Q&As and sharing a bit more about what I do online, you know, how I make money and how you guys can do that as well. So I'll throw the link down in the description, but for now, let's crack on with our story. A few years later, in 1982, a man by the name of Dave Clark, who was another surf adventurer, received a tip-off from John Ritter about this legendary wave off the coast of Fiji. Now, working as a teacher in American Samoa, Clark went to Fiji to find a piece of Cloudbreak for himself. A year later, after Clark had discovered Cloudbreak and had begun surfing it regularly, he set up a surf camp. And in setting up the camp, they managed to gain exclusive rights to the reefs surrounding Tavarua, which included Cloudbreak. Now, at first, the island resort was really basic. It basically comprised cabana-style beach huts right there in the sand. There was no electricity for most of the day, you know, not that much water. It was very basic, but at the same time, you had this amazing exclusivity where you had access to Cloudbreak, where nobody outside of that camp did. It was the first ever surf camp like this, you know. There was nowhere else in the world that promised a wave that you could come and surf and there would be no crowds and there would only be a limited amount of people. So while it was a wave that was becoming more and more famous with media coverage, you know, promoting Fiji and Cloudbreak as this amazing wave and this amazing resort, not everyone could just go and surf it. You know, you had to be staying on Tavarua. So on one hand, you had this amazing prospect where if you could afford it, you could go and surf these incredible waves, but if you couldn't afford it, you couldn't surf. But this dream scenario wasn't without controversy, and the resort was met with plenty of backlash for privatizing waves and excluding those who couldn't afford to stay at the resort. Now I've heard many stories over the years of surfers going on their own boats to try and surf Cloudbreak, and in most cases they were just getting told to fuck off and, you know, beat it by the island resort guests who had, you know, paid all this money to have the exclusivity. Obviously they're not going to be very happy at anybody else turning up. In some cases there was even fights where, you know, the resort guests would like actually beat up people trying to surf the wave. So yeah, let me know if you ever tried to surf it like back in the day. I'd love to hear your stories of it. I know a few of you have told me them already in my other video about like surf spot privatization, where I touch on Cloudbreak. But in 2010, the Fijian government decided to lift the ban and remove the exclusivity rights for the reefs everywhere in Fiji. So no longer did the island have this hold over the reef. Obviously the resort was still there and you had this amazing resort, but they could no longer promise this exclusivity and no crowds. And that week, the rumor has it that the resort almost closed down because all the guests that had paid and booked to surf by themselves no longer had that, so they cancelled. But at the same time, you now had this incredible wave that was open and accessible to everyone. And while this might seem like a negative thing, you know, because it brings the crowds, with the exclusivity, the locals couldn't even surf Cloudbreak. So, you know, now you had the local people that could go surf this amazing wave that was literally on their doorstep. You had surfers that could come from all over the world and experience this wonder of the surfing world. And as chance would have it, there are a couple of major swell events. You know, there's a huge swell in 2010 where Cloudbreak's full potential was revealed to the whole world. While it was known as this perfect wave before, everyone saw just how much potential it had, that it could handle this ridiculous amount of size. And we saw those first images and clips of like those huge, like 20-foot freight trains. And then obviously a few years later in 2012, we had that iconic thundercloud swell. If you haven't watched that thundercloud documentary, I'd highly recommend it because it's sick. And it goes into the history of, you know, the reef and exclusivity in a bit more detail and tells the story of that swell. It's a really cool watch. I'll leave the link to it down in the description if you want to check it out. So from then on, it grew and grew as a renowned surf destination. It began holding the CT event again. More and more surfers came, more resorts sprung up. You know, it wasn't just Tavarua and Namutu. You could stay on the mainland and go and surf Cloudbreak. You could stay on some of the neighboring islands. Anyone with access to a boat could go there and surf it. Now, obviously, Cloudbreak is now this renowned surf destination, and that obviously does come with the crowds. It's very famous. It was recently chosen as the new venue for the WSL Finals in 2025, which will be really sick to see. I think it's a really cool wave, especially if they get swell, to have that event. So what's the wave actually like? Now, personally, I found it really intimidating. I'm not that confident at like pig dogging on these like real powerful like left-hand reef passes. That's definitely not my forte. So I didn't enjoy it as much as some of you perhaps would. And it has many different faces as well. You know, it can be that huge open ocean kind of wave, where it can also be this like playful wally wave. Had a couple of days where it was pretty fun just for turns, and then some bigger, slightly more intimidating days as well, where there was this one day where it was just these dark blue like eyeballs like spinning down the reef, and it was really intimidating. Like, had this stiff offshore like running through it. But yeah, I found it really shallow. There's lots of different sections to it, so it's a huge playing field. The inside section called Shish Kebabs is like this really shallow section. Saw a guy break his leg out there, which is pretty hectic. And yeah, just found it like, it just wasn't my favorite wave basically. But I would love to go back on a smaller, like different type of swell, I guess. But if you're a bit of a charger, you would have loved it because it was like 6 to 8 foot and firing. If you want to read more about my experience of surfing Cloudbreak for the first time, I did like a 5-day trip there a few years ago. It's in my book, The Latin American Surf Tales. So if you want to check that out, the link's down in the description. Let me know if you surfed Cloudbreak as well, and let me know what your experiences were of it. If you can add to this story in any way, please let me know down in the comments, whether it be a story of you trying to surf it back in the day, or if you can provide more context around the privatization and its discovery, it'd be much appreciated. But hope you've enjoyed this video as well, guys. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, I know every YouTuber asks you to do this and you probably just switch off as soon as you hear it, but I found out the other day that basically all of you don't subscribe to my channel. So if you haven't, please subscribe, because it helps my channel more than you know. And yeah, it really means a lot to me. So for now, it's goodbye from me, and I'll see you in the next episode.